In this video, we are going to have a look at the new Sigma 85mm 1.4 DG/DN lens, and we are also going to do a bit of comparison with the new Lumix 85 1.8 lens. Kia ora, good morning everyone, Richard here, welcome back to the channel. Sigma has recently released a couple of new lenses that is specially designed for full-frame mirrorless cameras. So the new lenses are available for the Sony E mount and also the L mount cameras. The one I have here today is the Sigma 85 1.4 DG/DN lens, and this copy is for the L mount cameras. I know a lot of you guys who is looking at buying a portrait lens will be very interested in this lens, but also some of you may also be interested in the Panasonic Lumix 85 1.8. So in this video, I'm also going to do a bit of comparison between these two lenses so you can find out which lens is more suitable for you. Okay, let's start by talking about the design and build quality of this Sigma 85 1.4 lens. The build quality of this lens is very similar to the previous Sigma Art series lenses. The lens feel very well made and also feel quite dense when you hold it on the hand. The weight is around 630 grams, so it is not a lightweight lens at all. But having said that, if you compare it to the other Sigma Art series lenses, it is probably one of the smaller Art series lens from Sigma. There's a large focus ring at the front of the lens, and the ring itself feels pretty smooth for a autofocus lens. And then we have a autofocus and manual focus switch here, and also a button here for you to do a autofocus lock, which is also programmable button. And below here, there is a button for you to change how the aperture ring works. So by default, the aperture ring has clicks, which is what I like the most. But if you are a filmmaker, you will probably want to have a declicked aperture ring, which is very easy. You can just flick the switch, and now the aperture ring become a clickless aperture ring. So that is a very nice design. I would really love to see more lens manufacturers to have design like this on their lenses so that you can switch between the declicked or the normal aperture ring. You can use the aperture ring to change the aperture value from the maximum aperture f1.4 all the way to the minimum aperture f16. Or you can move it to the 8 mode, which means now you use the dial on your camera to adjust the aperture value. But not just that, there's also a switch here on this side of the lens. So once you flick it down, it will now lock the aperture ring. And what that means is if the aperture, you set it to the A mode, you cannot just change it back to the manual aperture value. Or if I am at the manual aperture setting here, if I lock it now, I can change between the different aperture settings here on the ring, but I cannot easily go back to the 8 mode. So that is a very useful and very important feature, because when you actually want to manually change the aperture ring, but you may accidentally just change it a little bit too much and go from f16 all the way to 8. So this is a feature to avoid that from happening. The lens has a 77mm front filter thread, and the lens is also weather sealed, so it shouldn't be a problem if you want to take some photos or do some videos under bad weather condition. Comparing the Sigma with the Lumix 85 1.8, the Lumix is definitely quite a bit smaller and also quite a bit lighter. The Lumix is only around 350 grams, which is approximately half the weight of the Sigma lens. So if you're holding these two lenses, definitely the Sigma feel a lot denser than the Lumix lens. Build quality wise, I think the Lumix lens build quality is pretty good, but it definitely feel a bit more plasticky compared to the Sigma. There's only one switch on the Lumix, which is the AF/MF switch, while on the Sigma you have a couple of more switches and buttons, and also the Sigma has the aperture ring, which is something that is missing on the Lumix lens. When taking photos using this Sigma 85 1.4 lens with a Panasonic Lumix S5 running firmware 2.0, the autofocus speed is very fast and the autofocus operation is also very quiet and also pretty smooth. Face detection works quite well most of the time, because sometimes I notice that even though the camera can detect the face when I half press the trigger button or I use the AF button, it would refuse to lock on or refuse to focus on the target. It seems to happen most frequently when the current focus setting is quite a bit different from where my target is. So if that happens, I normally have to focus on like another object that is somewhere in between the current and the target distance. Then the camera and lens would then focus on the target successfully. This is something that will also happen occasionally with the Lumix 85 1.8 lens, but it seems to happen a bit more often with this Sigma 85 1.4 lens. Another thing I noticed with this Sigma 85mm lens is when I was taking my sharpness test photos, I have the Sigma lens mount on the S5 and on the tripod, and when I was half pressing the shutter button to refocus on the target, which actually doesn't move because both the camera and my target is fixed, but every time when I half press the shutter button, you will see the camera will hunt back and forth a little bit before it decides to lock on the target. If I switch to the Lumix lens, it doesn't really happen. Well, I say it doesn't really happen because I do see still a tiny bit of hunt back and forth even with the Lumix lens, but with the Sigma lens, that hunting back and forth is definitely a little bit more noticeable. I don't think it really would matter when you are taking real-world photo, but there is a bit of difference when you are trying to do a single autofocus with the Sigma and the Lumix lens. When shooting video in continuous autofocus using the face tracking, when shooting at the maximum aperture f1.4 or near maximum aperture like f1.8, the Sigma lens, well, it doesn't really follow focus very well. Look at this test video I shot with the Sigma at f1.8 when I walk from far away to in front of the camera. The camera cannot really follow me at all until I stop in front of the camera. In comparison, the autofocus tracking with the Lumix lens using the same camera setting definitely is quite a bit better. It's still a bit slow, it still takes a bit of time to actually follow me, but overall the Lumix lens autofocus tracking definitely works quite a bit better, especially when you are shooting at a large aperture setting. If you want to get better autofocus tracking performance when shooting video with this Sigma lens, you can do that by increasing the frame rate of the video that you are shooting. Look at this sample video. I was shooting at the Full HD at 50 frames per second. Now you can see there is some noticeable improvement in terms of autofocus tracking. Now the camera is managed to track my motion when I was walking from far away towards the camera. It is still a little bit slow, but the performance is definitely much better than when I was shooting at 25 frames per second. But once again, if I switch to the Lumix lens and shoot the video using the exactly same camera settings, the autofocus tracking with the Lumix lens is quite a bit better than the Sigma lens again. Okay, now let's have a look at the image quality and let's start from image sharpness first. All the image sharpness test photos were shot with a Panasonic Lumix S5 using its high resolution 96 megapixel multi-shot mode. With the Sigma 50mm f1.4 lens, the center sharpness is excellent even at the maximum aperture f1.4. Let's zoom in this test photo and look at the center of the photo at f1.4. The image sharpness is already very good. When I stop down the Sigma lens, the image sharpness actually doesn't improve that much because it was already very good at the maximum aperture f1.4. You may see the contrast increase a little bit as I stop down the lens, but otherwise the center sharpness is already excellent even at the maximum aperture. When I did my Lumix 85 1.8 lens review, I said the Lumix lens, the center sharpness is very good. And yeah, if you look at this photo I shot at f1.8, you can see the center sharpness is indeed very good. But if I put the test photo from the Sigma and the Lumix side by side, then I notice the Sigma center sharpness is noticeably better than the Lumix lens. Okay, now let's look at the corner image sharpness. With the Sigma 85 1.4 lens, at the maximum aperture, the corner image sharpness is okay. You have to stop down to around f2.8 or so, and then the corner image sharpness become very good. Interestingly, this time the Lumix lens actually has slightly better corner image sharpness from wide open all the way to around f2 or so, but once you stop down to f2.8 or even further, then the corner sharpness of these two lenses are very similar. The quality of the bokeh is very important for a 85mm portrait lens, and with this Sigma lens, when you are shooting at the maximum aperture f1.4, the bokeh is very smooth and looks very pleasant, and there's also not too much cat's eye effect near the corner of the frame as well. And as you stop down the lens, the bokeh still remains relatively round and smooth. If you compare the bokeh from the Sigma lens with the Lumix lens, I think overall the quality of the bokeh looks very similar. Both lenses render very nice bokeh, but I would say the bokeh from the Sigma looks just a little bit smoother, and you can see the transition from the edge of the bokeh to the center of the bokeh looks just a little bit smoother if you compare it with the Lumix lens. But another advantage with the Sigma lens is because it has the maximum aperture f1.4 compared to the Lumix, which is f1.8. So if you're shooting at the maximum aperture with the Sigma lens, you can have a little bit more bokeh, you can dissolve the background a little bit more, and you can have a little bit more shadow depth of field compared to the Lumix lens. Taking photo at the maximum aperture f1.4 with the Sigma lens, there is some noticeable vignetting near the edge and corner of the frame. Stop down to f2, it would improve quite a bit, and when you stop down to f2.8, then vignetting is only marginally noticeable. With the Lumix lens, vignetting is also quite noticeable when you are shooting at the maximum aperture. Compared it with the Sigma, I think the amount of vignetting is very similar between these two lenses at the wide open or near wide open aperture. When you stop down the lens to f4 or smaller aperture, then the Lumix lens seems to have a little bit less vignetting when you compare it with the Sigma lens. Both the Sigma lens and the Lumix lens, there is very minimal amount of distortion. Even look at these brick wall photos, both lenses has very minimal, almost non-noticeable amount of distortion. One interesting thing I noticed when I was looking at these two brick wall photos is because I took this photo at the exact same position using a tripod. So it seems like when the focus distance is at like a medium focus distance, about a couple of meters away, the Sigma lens has a slightly narrower field of view comparing to the Lumix lens. Lens flare is reasonably well controlled by the Sigma lens. Even without using the provided lens hood, most of the photos and videos I shot, I don't really have any lens flare issue. But if I directly shooting into the sun on a bright sunny day, I do see a bit of ghosting in my video like this one. With the Lumix lens, I also would have a bit of ghosting if I'm shooting under this kind of condition, but the amount of ghosting with the Lumix lens seems to be a little bit less than the Sigma lens. With the Sigma lens, if you stop down to the minimum aperture f16, you can get some pretty nice looking 22-point sunstar from its 11-blade round diaphragm. The Lumix lens can stop down all the way to f22, which should give you a little bit more sunstars, but comparing the sunstars from these two lenses, I think I still prefer the sunstar from the Sigma lens a little bit more. Chromatic aberration is very well controlled by this Sigma lens. Even when I'm shooting at f1.4, the amount of color fringing is still kept at very minimal level. Now there's something that is a bit interesting with this chromatic aberration sample photo that I shot at the maximum aperture f1.4. You can see there is quite a bit of ghosting because the sun was just directly in front of the camera, just outside the frame. Now if I stop down the lens to f2, then the ghosting is largely disappeared. With the Lumix lens, the sample photo I shot at f1.8, there is also quite a bit of ghosting, but when I stop down to f2, the ghosting doesn't really disappear unlike the Sigma lens. If you are a videographer and planning to use the Sigma lens to do a bit of video filming, you need to be aware that the Sigma lens has a bit of focus breathing. The amount of focus breathing is very similar to the Lumix lens. This Sigma 85 1.4 DGDN lens is pretty much exactly what I expected it would be. The build quality is very solid and the overall image quality is very decent. I really like that it has an aperture ring and you can choose between the decrypted and normal mode. And I also like how it has a switch on the side here which allow you to lock the aperture ring in one of the operation mode. Comparing this lens with the Lumix lens, I think they are both very good lenses. So it's hard to say which one is the better lens as they both have their own pros and cons. And I think for someone to choose between these two lenses, it really depends on what is the most important things to you. The biggest advantage with the Sigma lens is that its maximum aperture is f1.4. So for example, when you are shooting portrait, you can have more bokeh and also you can have a more shadow depth of field look in your photo. And also when you are shooting under very low light condition, the slightly faster maximum aperture would also help you improve the image quality as well. The Lumix lens, on the other hand, is quite a bit lighter, is a bit more compact, and also it is also a bit cheaper. But the build quality does feel a bit more plasticky and it doesn't have the aperture ring and some of the buttons and switches that is available on the Sigma lens. But if you plan to take some video using autofocus, the Lumix lens would have better autofocus performance compared to the Sigma lens. So it's really hard to choose between these two lenses. As I said, each one of them has pros and cons, but it's a good thing that as a consumer, you have more choices. You can choose between which one that is most suitable for you.